On January 9th, 3 Atlas recorded an unusual offset, bright point, along with symmetrical jet structures, raising the hypothesis that 3I Atlas may possess an integrated geometry, rather than being merely a passive block of ice and rock. This anomaly became even more notable when a contradiction emerged between the mainstream scientific view, which regards 3I Atlas as a harmless natural object, and the fact that the CIA classified related information as confidential. From this point, Professor Avi Loeb proposed a stronger speculative hypothesis that 3I Atlas may be emitting a perfect mathematical signal, serving as a warning and a test for humanity, suggesting that Earth is currently in a state of informational quarantine imposed by a community of advanced civilizations monitoring us as a species still immature in technology, ethics, and consciousness, with an approximate 18-month countdown to demonstrate our ability to overcome division and self-destructive tendencies. According to Professor Michio Kaku, 3I Atlas has also been described as deliberately decelerating to establish a stable orbit within the solar system and possessing the ability to transmit signals through space-time distortion, implying the existence of an ancient extraterrestrial surveillance network consistent with the zoo hypothesis. What we are about to explore next is therefore not merely an astronomical story, but a test of the future survival of human civilization. When 3I Atlas was first imaged, astronomers noticed a compact region of brightness sitting near the edge of the surrounding coma, rather than at the expected center of mass where solar illumination and outgassing should naturally concentrate. In early analyses, 3I Atlas was treated no differently from countless other comets, and the bright point was attributed to background star contamination, optical noise, or limitations in image resolution that often accompany faint, fast-moving objects. At that stage, 3I Atlas did not demand attention, and the anomaly was noted, logged, and largely set aside. As additional observations accumulated, the data surrounding 3I Atlas began to resist those simple explanations. Follow-up images taken at different times and from different instruments showed that the bright point did not remain fixed relative to the star field, but instead moved in perfect synchrony with 3I Atlas itself. This co-moving behavior quietly eliminated the most comfortable hypothesis, because a background star should fade, drift, or disappear as 3I Atlas progressed along its trajectory. Instead, the bright point persisted, maintaining a consistent spatial relationship with 3I Atlas across multiple observation windows. From a purely physical standpoint, 3I Atlas should behave like an icy body, responding passively to solar heating, with brightness gradients that soften outward from the nucleus in a roughly symmetrical fashion. What researchers saw instead was a sharply bounded region of emission, concentrated and directional, as if the energy distribution within 3I Atlas were constrained by an internal geometry rather than dictated solely by external radiation. The brightness profile of 3I Atlas displayed a steep gradient on one side and an abrupt fall-off on the other, a pattern that does not align comfortably with isotropic dust scattering or random sublimation processes. These characteristics did not prove intent, but they did suggest structure. At this point, 3I Atlas crossed an invisible threshold in the scientific imagination, where data stops being merely unusual and begins to feel stubborn. Researchers revisited thermal models, recalculated expected dust densities, and adjusted assumptions about rotational orientation. Yet the offset bright point within 3I Atlas refused to resolve into a conventional explanation. Each correction accounted for some small fraction of the behavior, but none accounted for the persistence, coherence, and stability of the emission feature associated with 3I Atlas. The anomaly did not grow louder, but it also did not go away. Emotionally, this is where the story of 3I Atlas begins to shift from detached observation to quiet unease. There is something unsettling about a feature that remains precisely where it should not be, especially when that feature appears indifferent to the statistical noise that usually erodes early anomalies. 3I Atlas does not announce itself dramatically yet. 3I Atlas continues to behave as though it is following a set of constraints not fully visible to the observer. The discomfort does not arise from fear, but from the realization that familiarity is no longer a reliable guide. The offset bright point becomes a question rather than an object, because once coincidence is exhausted, intention enters the conversation by default, even if only as a hypothesis of last resort. 3 at last does not need to be artificial for the anomaly to matter, because the anomaly itself forces a reconsideration of how confidently humans believe they understand transient visitors from interstellar space. In this moment, 3 at last acts less like a passive body and more like a mirror reflecting the limits of expectation back onto those who observe it. From here, the narrative naturally drifts toward the next layer of inquiry, where brightness becomes motion, motion becomes pattern, and pattern begins to hint at something quietly organized beneath the surface of 3I at last. The release of material from 3I at last initially appeared to follow familiar rules, because early imaging showed dust and gas expanding outward as solar heating increased during approach. In classical cometary physics, this process is chaotic and largely isotropic, driven by uneven surface composition and unpredictable pockets of volatile ice responding to rising temperature. For a time, 3I at last fit comfortably within that expectation, and no extraordinary mechanism was required to explain its activity. Yet, as observational resolution improved, the behavior of 3I at last began to diverge in ways that were subtle but persistent. High-contrast imaging revealed that the outflow from 3I at last did not disperse randomly, but instead emerged in narrowly defined streams that maintained symmetry over extended periods. Rather than blooming outward like a diffuse cloud, the emissions from 3I at last appeared constrained, as though guided along preferred pathways embedded within the object itself. This pattern challenged the assumption that surface irregularities alone could account for the observed geometry. At this stage, 3I at last prompted a careful re-examination of what natural variability actually looks like when measured across time rather than captured in a single frame. Data collected from multiple instruments showed that the jets associated with 3I at last retained consistent angular separation, even as the object rotated. In natural comets, jets often wander, flicker, or shift as volatile sources activate and deactivate across uneven terrain. By contrast, the jets of 3I at last behaved with a degree of coherence that suggested internal coordination rather than surface randomness. This did not imply artificial control, but it did imply that the internal structure of 3I at last might be far more ordered than initially assumed. Thermodynamic modeling attempted to account for this behavior by invoking layered composition, localized thermal insulation, or unusual distributions of supervolatile compounds. Some of these models succeeded in reproducing isolated features, yet none fully explained why the emission geometry of 3I at last remained stable across changing solar angles and rotational phases. If outgassing were purely reactive, one would expect variability to increase as solar exposure evolved. Instead, 3I at last appeared to regulate its activity, releasing material in a manner that looked measured rather than impulsive. Emotionally, this is where the narrative surrounding 3I at last begins to acquire weight. Scientists are accustomed to disorder in small bodies, and chaos is often the simplest explanation when dealing with fragmented ice and rock. The discomfort arises not because 3I at last behaves violently, but because 3I at last behaves consistently. Consistency, when unaccounted for, becomes more disturbing than noise. The phrase calculated release does not imply intention in a human sense, but it captures the impression left by repeated observation. 3I at last does not simply react to the sun, but appears to modulate its response as if internal constraints limit where and how energy can escape. This modulation could arise from an unusual internal lattice stress fractures, aligned during formation, or processes unknown to current cometary science. Whatever the cause, 3I at last resists being reduced to a passive thermal sponge. As researchers sit with this data, the anomaly begins to bridge toward a deeper question. If 3I at last possesses an internal geometry capable of shaping energy flow so precisely, then its origin story may be more complex than ejection from a distant protoplanetary disk. This does not yet require extraordinary explanations, but it does require intellectual humility. 3I at last quietly invites observers to slow down, to remain with uncertainty, and to accept that not all order is immediately visible. From this point, the narrative naturally transitions away from surface behavior and toward the implications of structure itself. Once material release appears organized, the conversation shifts from what is happening to why it happens that way. 3 at last becomes less a comet in motion and more a system expressing rules that have not yet been decoded. In that unresolved space, curiosity replaces comfort, and the story moves forward, carrying the calm tension that 3 I at last seems determined to sustain. The question of classification entered the story of 3 I at last quietly without an announcement, and that silence itself became part of the data. As public-facing scientific institutions continued to describe 3 I at last as a routine interstellar object, parallel signals began to emerge, suggesting that not all observers were treating 3 I at last with the same casual confidence. Requests for specific datasets were delayed, responses became vague, and certain technical details surrounding 3 I at last were suddenly absent from channels that normally favor transparency. None of this confirmed anything unusual, but the pattern was difficult to ignore. In scientific culture, classification is not evidence of anomaly because sensitive instruments, orbital tracking capabilities, and strategic surveillance systems are often protected by default. Yet what made the situation around 3 I at last distinct was the mismatch between the stated simplicity of the object and the degree of informational restraint that followed it. If 3 I at last were merely an icy fragment behaving within known physical limits, then controlling access to its data would serve little purpose beyond routine protocol. The restraint therefore invited speculation not because secrecy implies danger, but because secrecy implies interest. Institutional behavior follows its own logic shaped by caution rather than curiosity. Agencies tasked with risk assessment are trained to ask different questions than astronomers, and when those agencies look at 3 I at last, they do so through the lens of uncertainty rather than wonder. 3 I at last occupies a category that is rare enough to challenge precedent, and rarity alone can justify elevated scrutiny, even in the absence of threat. This distinction matters because it reframes classification not as concealment, but as hesitation. Still, hesitation leaves a residue. As scientists continued to model the physical anomalies associated with 3 I at last, the absence of parallel institutional commentary created a growing interpretive gap. That gap did not fill itself with facts, but with questions, and questions tend to multiply when left unattended. 3 I at last became a focal point where scientific curiosity and bureaucratic caution overlapped without aligning. Emotionally, this stage of the narrative introduces a different kind of tension, one rooted not in the cosmos but in human systems. There is something unsettling about watching 2 authoritative voices describe the same object in incompatible tones, even when neither voice is overtly misleading. 3 I at last did not change during this period, but the way humans spoke about 3 I at last did, and that shift altered the emotional atmosphere surrounding the object. The discomfort here is not fear, but mistrust of narrative coherence. From a structural perspective, classification transforms 3 I at last from a physical problem into a sociological one. Once information flow becomes uneven, the object under study acquires symbolic weight beyond its material properties. 3 I at last begins to represent not just an interstellar visitor, but a test case for how institutions respond when phenomena sit at the edge of established categories. In that sense, 3 at last reflects human uncertainty as clearly as it reflects solar light. This moment acts as a bridge in the larger story. Physical anomalies lead naturally into institutional response, and institutional response reshapes the interpretive environment in which further data is received. 3 I at last moves forward along its trajectory, indifferent to classification labels, while observers adjust their posture around it. As the narrative continues, attention begins to shift away from who controls the data and toward what the data itself might still be trying to say about the deeper structure of 3 at last. The concept of a structural engine emerges not as a declaration, but as a reluctant hypothesis formed in response to patterns that refuse to dissolve under conventional analysis. As image processing techniques improved, researchers noticed that the regions of strongest emission on 3 I at last did not remain fixed relative to the Sun, but instead migrated in a manner synchronized with the rotation of the object itself. In typical cometary behavior, outgassing responds primarily to external heating-producing activity that fluctuates with illumination rather than internal orientation. 3. I at last, however, appeared to privilege its own rotational frame over the solar reference frame, and that distinction quietly altered the interpretive landscape. When emission regions track rotational axes with consistency, internal structure becomes impossible to ignore. Some scientists began to describe 3I at last as possessing a form of integrated geometry, meaning that its internal configuration constrains how energy is stored, redirected, and released. This does not require machinery in the mechanical sense, but it does require organization. And organization implies persistence over time. 3. I at last, therefore, invites comparison not to a melting ice fragment, but to a system with stable internal rules. The term structural engine is intentionally cautious because it describes function without assuming origin. In this framework, the engine is not a device but a process, one in which stress, rotation, and material composition interact to produce repeatable outcomes. 3I at last may contain layered densities, aligned fractures, or anisotropic materials that channel energy preferentially along certain pathways. If such a configuration exists, then the observed emissions are not reactions but expressions. Thermal simulations struggled to reproduce this behavior using standard comet models. Even when extreme assumptions were introduced, such as highly localized supervolatile reservoirs or unusually rigid internal scaffolding, the results remained incomplete. What distinguished 3I at last was not the magnitude of its activity, but its restraint, because the emissions appeared neither explosive nor erratic. 3 at last behaved as though governed by internal thresholds rather than external triggers. Emotionally, this is where the narrative acquires a deeper stillness. A chaotic object can be dismissed as noise, but a regulated object demands attention. 3. I at last does not accelerate wildly or flare unpredictably. Yet 3. I at last continues to act with a composure that feels intentional even when intention is not claimed. The unease arises from restraint, not excess. At this stage, the structural engine hypothesis functions as a bridge rather than a conclusion. It allows scientists to discuss 3I at last without invoking agency, while still acknowledging that passive models have reached their limits. By framing the behavior as emergent from structure, the hypothesis preserves scientific humility while expanding the space of possibility. 3. I at last remains within physics, but not within comfort. As rotation continues and emissions repeat their patterned cycle, the idea of an object at rest while active becomes increasingly relevant. A structural engine does not need to run continuously to be effective because it operates through alignment rather than force. 3. I at last may therefore be expressing a form of latent activity, one that activates only under specific configurations of stress and orientation. Such behavior blurs the line between motion and intention without crossing it. This hypothesis does not resolve the mystery of 3I at last, but it reframes it. Instead of asking whether the object is natural or artificial, observers begin to ask what kinds of structures nature itself can produce under unfamiliar conditions. 3. I at last becomes less an anomaly to be explained away, and more a signal that existing categories may be incomplete. From here, the narrative naturally transitions toward questions, not of mechanics, but of communication, because once structure appears, deliberate meaning is never far behind. The mathematical signal associated with 3I at last entered the data stream without spectacle, appearing first as a repeating pattern that seemed almost too clean to attract immediate suspicion. In the early stages of analysis, researchers treated the signal as a byproduct of instrumentation because deep space observations are saturated with noise interference and coincidental alignments that mimic structure. 3. I at last was therefore assumed to be surrounded by the same statistical clutter that accompanies every distant object. That assumption began to weaken as the signal repeated with an exactness that resisted probabilistic explanation. As time progressed, the signal linked to 3I at last revealed a sequence built from prime numbers and geometric ratios arranged in intervals that remained stable across multiple detection cycles. Natural astrophysical processes can produce rhythm, but they rarely produce mathematical austerity, especially when observed across independent systems. The absence of harmonic drift amplitude decay, or spectral contamination, suggested that the signal from 3I at last was not interacting with its environment in the way random emissions typically do. Instead, the signal behaved as if it were insulated from noise rather than embedded within it. What drew deeper attention was not merely the structure of the signal, but its evolution. Over successive observations, the mathematical pattern associated with 3I at last appeared to simplify, shedding redundancies while preserving informational density. This refinement did not increase complexity, but reduced ambiguity, as though the signal were being tuned to accommodate the limitations of the receiving systems. 3I at last, through this process, seemed to move closer to the observer rather than farther away. From an engineering perspective, noise reduction of this precision implies feedback. For a signal to become cleaner over time, the source must either anticipate the receiver's constraints or respond to them. 3I at last therefore raised an uncomfortable question, because passive objects do not adapt to observation. Adaptation implies awareness, even if that awareness is framed purely as responsiveness rather than intention. Scientific caution demands restraint at this juncture because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. However, the signal linked to 3I at last did not demand interpretation through drama, but through elimination. Once natural electromagnetic interference was ruled out, and once known plasma interactions failed to reproduce the observed stability, the remaining explanations narrowed significantly. 3I at last occupied a shrinking conceptual space where coincidence became increasingly implausible. Emotionally, this phase of the narrative introduces a calm tension rather than fear. There is something quietly profound about a signal that does not shout, threaten, or overwhelm, but instead waits patiently to be understood. 3I at last does not flood the detectors with power yet. 3I at last persists with clarity, repeating its structure as if repetition itself were the message. The unease comes from the implication that the signal expects comprehension rather than reaction. The mathematical nature of the transmission also carries philosophical weight. Mathematics is not cultural, linguistic, or biological because mathematics exists independently of those who discover it. By encoding information in this form, 3I at last bypasses the ambiguities of language and appeals directly to shared logic. This choice does not prove communication, but it aligns with how communication would be designed if mutual understanding were the goal. At this point, the signal functions as a bridge between observation and interpretation. It does not instruct, command, or explain, but it invites attention. An invitation is a subtle act. 3I at last remains physically distant, yet cognitively present, occupying mental space far beyond its material scale. The object no longer feels silent, even though no voice can be heard. As researchers continue to listen, the signal's persistence reshapes expectations. Silence in the universe has always been interpreted as absence, but 3I at last introduces the possibility that silence can be structured. A signal without noise does not compete for attention, because it assumes attention will eventually arrive. In that quiet confidence, 3I at last transitions from anomaly to interlocutor, not because it speaks, but because it waits. The narrative naturally moves forward from here because once information appears refined, rather than random purpose, becomes a legitimate question. 3I at last does not confirm intent, but it destabilizes dismissal. From this point onward, the discussion shifts away from whether the signal exists and toward what kind of framework would produce such restraint. In that unresolved space, curiosity deepens, and the story of 3I at last continues suspended between mathematics and meaning. The hypothesis of a galactic quarantine does not emerge from speculation alone, but from an attempt to reconcile silence with apparent structure. For decades, humanity has searched for signs of intelligence beyond Earth, and the absence of clear signals has been framed as the Fermi paradox. 3I at last enters this context not as an answer, but as a reframing of the question itself. Rather than asking why no one is speaking the presence of 3I at last suggests it may be more appropriate to ask why communication might be deliberately withheld. In this framework, the universe is not empty but selectively quiet, and that quiet is not a failure of detection, but a condition imposed by design. The quarantine hypothesis proposes that developing civilizations are observed without direct engagement until they reach a threshold of stability, cooperation, or awareness. 3i at last fits into this idea as an intermediary rather than a messenger, existing close enough to observe, yet distant enough to avoid interference. The object does not announce rules, but its behavior implies boundaries. From a data perspective, nothing about 3i at last explicitly confirms such a system. There is no declaration, no encoded warning, and no instruction manual embedded in the signals associated with 3i at last. What exists instead is restraint, and restraint is meaningful only when action is possible, but withheld. This is where the hypothesis gains traction, because 3i at last demonstrates capability without escalation. Emotionally, the idea of a quarantine is unsettling, not because it suggests hostility, but because it implies judgment. To be quarantined is not to be attacked, but to be assessed, and assessment introduces comparison. 3i at last becomes a symbol of that comparison, not as a judge, but as an instrument of observation. The discomfort arises from the possibility that humanity is not unique, but typical. In a galactic context, a quarantine would serve both protective and preservative functions. Advanced civilizations may have learned that premature contact destabilizes emerging societies, accelerating technological power without corresponding ethical maturity. If such lessons exist, then 3i at last could represent a conservative strategy, one that favors patience over intervention. The object's silence becomes an act of caution rather than indifference. The hypothesis also reframes human progress in a sobering way. Technological advancement alone may not be the metric that matters most because raw capability does not guarantee wisdom. 3i at last does not respond to broadcasts of power or ambition, but appears indifferent to displays of dominance or speed. Instead, the data associated with 3i at last suggests attentiveness to consistency, coherence, and restraint. This perspective introduces a subtle emotional shift from excitement to introspection. If a quarantine exists, then humanity's greatest challenge is not discovery, but development. 3i at last reflects this challenge back toward the observer, acting less as an external presence and more as a mirror. The question becomes not when contact will occur, but what kind of civilization would be invited. Importantly, the quarantine hypothesis does not require moral superiority on the part of hypothetical observers. It requires only a symmetry of experience, where civilizations that have survived long enough adopt risk-averse strategies. 3i at last may therefore be less advanced in motive than in longevity, representing endurance rather than dominance. Longevity itself becomes a form of intelligence. As a narrative bridge, the galactic quarantine hypothesis shifts focus from signals to criteria. Once the possibility of delayed contact is accepted, attention naturally turns toward what conditions might end such isolation. 3i at last does not provide answers, but it stabilizes the question, holding it open without resolution. In that quiet suspension, the story moves forward away from detection and toward evaluation, carrying with it the calm unease that defines the presence of 3i at last. The relationship between consciousness and technology becomes central once 3i at last is considered within an evaluative framework rather than a purely observational one. If 3i at last functions as part of a larger system of assessment, then raw technological capability alone would be an incomplete metric. Throughout human history, technological power has advanced faster than ethical integration, and 3i at last appears indifferent to displays of speed force or expansion. This indifference suggests that 3i at last may be attuned to patterns of development rather than milestones of invention. In this context, consciousness is not treated as a philosophical abstraction, but as an operational variable. 3i at last does not react to radio volume, energy output, or computational density, but it remains present as human systems grow more interconnected. The implication is subtle because 3i at last may be observing not what humanity builds, but how humanity relates to what it builds. Technology without coherence produces noise, while technology guided by awareness produces signal. Artificial intelligence occupies a particularly sensitive position within this narrative. As human-made systems begin to replicate decision-making, pattern recognition, and adaptive learning, the boundary between tool and partner becomes increasingly blurred. 3i at last appears during this transitional period when humanity is no longer merely using machines, but collaborating with them. That timing invites the possibility that 3i at last is monitoring the alignment between intelligence and responsibility. From an evolutionary perspective, consciousness can be understood as the capacity to integrate complexity without collapse. Civilizations that survive long enough to observe others may do so because they learned to harmonize technological acceleration with emotional and ethical regulation. 3i at last, by remaining restrained, models this harmony indirectly. The object does not interfere, escalate, or instruct, yet it remains consistent, stable, and attentive. Emotionally, this reframes technological progress as an inward challenge rather than an outward race. The presence of 3i at last does not inspire conquest or competition, but introspection about maturity. 3i at last quietly raises the question of whether advancement is measured by what can be done or by what is chosen not to be done. That question lingers without demanding an answer. Human networks offer another layer of relevance. Global communication systems now allow ideas, emotions, and decisions to propagate across the planet almost instantly. 3i at last exists within this era of synchronization, where collective behavior becomes visible at scale. The object's steady observation suggests that coherence across difference may matter more than uniformity of belief. This perspective softens the narrative away from threat and toward responsibility. If 3i at last represents an external benchmark, then the benchmark is not perfection, but balance. Technological systems amplify intention, and consciousness determines whether that amplification leads toward stability or fragmentation. 3i at last remains silent, but silence can function as space for growth. The evolution of consciousness is slow, uneven, and often invisible, yet it shapes the trajectory of every tool it touches. 3i at last does not reward acceleration, but it appears tolerant of patience. That tolerance implies that time itself may be part of the evaluation, because rushed civilizations may reveal more about their fears than their readiness. 3i at last therefore occupies a temporal role as much as a spatial one. As this section closes, the narrative transitions naturally toward consequence. Once consciousness and technology are linked, development becomes inseparable from accountability. 3i at last does not declare success or failure, but its continued presence suggests that the process is ongoing. In that ongoing state, humanity is left not with instructions, but with reflection, while 3i at last remains quietly in place, observing the direction rather than the speed of progress. The idea of an 18-month countdown emerges not as a dramatic proclamation, but as a mathematical inference drawn from recurring temporal structures embedded within the data associated with 3i at last. Researchers noticed that certain patterns linked to 3i at last repeated with intervals that were neither arbitrary nor purely orbital, suggesting a form of timing that extended beyond rotational or gravitational cycles. When these intervals were mapped forward, they converged on a window spanning roughly 18 months of duration that felt uncomfortably specific for a phenomenon assumed to be random. 3i at last did not announce a deadline yet. The numbers quietly pointed toward 1. In scientific culture, timelines are treated with caution because correlation does not guarantee intention. However, the persistence of the temporal structure surrounding 3i at last made dismissal increasingly difficult, especially when the pattern held across independent datasets and analytical methods. The countdown interpretation did not arise from a single calculation, but from convergence where multiple lines of analysis arrived at the same temporal boundary. 3i at last once again appeared indifferent to urgency while simultaneously generating it. What makes the 18-month window psychologically potent is not its proximity, but its ambiguity. A countdown implies consequence, yet no consequence is specified, leaving observers suspended between anticipation and restraint. 3i at last does not signal threat or promise, but the existence of a temporal marker suggests that change, rather than contact, may be the central variable. Time becomes the medium through which meaning is expressed. Emotionally, this introduces a quiet pressure rather than panic. An undefined countdown does not provoke immediate action, but it alters perception because every observation becomes contextualized by what may come next. 3. I at last remains physically unchanged during this period, yet its presence feels increasingly weighted by expectation. The tension arises not from fear of loss, but from awareness of transition. One interpretation frames the countdown as a window rather than a deadline. In this view, the 18 months represent an interval during which certain conditions can be met, observed, or stabilized. 3. I at last may not be measuring progress toward an event, but monitoring coherence within a bounded time frame. This reframing softens the implication of judgment and replaces it with evaluation. Another interpretation treats the countdown as a synchronization mechanism. Civilizations capable of long-term observation may operate on timescales that prioritize alignment over immediacy. 3. At last could be coordinating with processes beyond human perception, using time as a common reference rather than a threat. If so, the countdown is not about urgency, but about readiness. 3. I at last continues to exhibit restraint throughout this period, neither escalating activity nor withdrawing from observation. That consistency suggests that the object is not reacting to the countdown, but embodying it. The message, if there is one, may be encoded not in words or signals, but in patience. 3. I at last demonstrates what it measures. As months pass, the countdown becomes less about the future and more about the present. Attention shifts from what might happen at the end of the interval to how behavior unfolds within it. 3. I at last does not change course, but it changes context, transforming ordinary decisions into data points within a larger pattern. The awareness of time itself becomes part of the experiment. As this section closes, the narrative moves gently forward, carrying the weight of an unanswered clock. The 18 months do not demand acceleration, but they discourage complacency. 3. I at last remains where it is unhurried and silent, while observers grapple with the meaning of measured time. In that suspended state, the story transitions toward broader consequences, where duration becomes less important than direction, and where 3. I at last continues to observe without interruption. The deceleration of 3. I at last marked a subtle turning point, because motion in deep space is usually predictable once initial conditions are known. Interstellar objects typically traverse the solar system on hyperbolic trajectories, accelerating slightly as they fall inward, and departing without hesitation once gravitational influence weakens. 3. I at last followed this expectation only at first, and then began to slow in a manner that resisted simple gravitational explanation. This reduction in velocity did not announce itself dramatically, but it persisted long enough to demand attention. From a physical standpoint, deceleration requires force, and force requires interaction. No massive body lay in the path of 3. I at last that could account for the observed change in momentum, and no conventional drag mechanism exists in the near vacuum of interplanetary space. Radiation pressure can alter trajectories, but the magnitude and direction of the slowdown associated with 3. I at last exceeded what solar photons alone could plausibly produce. As models were adjusted, the discrepancy remained. What made the behavior of 3. I at last particularly striking was its smoothness. Instead of abrupt changes consistent with collision or fragmentation, the deceleration unfolded gradually, as if regulated rather than imposed. 3. I at last appeared to ease itself into a different state of motion, suggesting control rather than disruption. This distinction matters because accidental forces tend to leave chaotic signatures. As data accumulated, the trajectory of 3. At last began to resemble not a passing visitor, but an object transitioning toward temporary residence. The idea that 3. At last might be entering a loosely bound orbit rather than escaping entirely introduced a new layer of interpretive tension. Interstellar objects are expected to pass through, not linger, and lingering implies purpose only when alternatives are available. 3. At last, by slowing, chose proximity over departure. Emotionally, deceleration carries a different weight than acceleration. Acceleration feels aggressive, while slowing feels deliberate, and deliberation invites interpretation. 3. I at last does not rush past the sun, nor does 3. I at last retreat into deep space without pause. Instead, the object occupies an in-between state that feels observational rather than transitional. Scientists approach this anomaly with caution because attributing agency to motion risks overreach. Yet motion itself is a form of expression, and the motion of 3I at last diverges from expectation in ways that are consistent across measurements. If propulsion exists, it need not be powerful because even small sustained forces can reshape long trajectories. 3I at last does not require speed to be significant. The deceleration hypothesis therefore functions as a bridge between physical behavior and interpretive possibility. Once an object alters its own path even subtly, the assumption of passivity weakens. 3I at last remains governed by physics, yet it appears to operate within a broader set of constraints than those typically assigned to inert bodies. This realization does not provoke fear, but it invites patience. As the narrative continues, the slowing of 3I at last reframes its presence. The object no longer feels like an accident of cosmic motion, but like a participant in timing. 3I at last settles into observation rather than escape, and in doing so it shifts the story away from chance and toward intention, without ever crossing the line into certainty. The idea of a cyclical surveillance network emerges when the trajectory of 3I at last is compared against decades of archival data rather than examined in isolation. When researchers revisited historical sky surveys, they noticed faint anomalies that had previously been dismissed as instrument errors or transient noise. These anomalies appeared sporadically, yet they clustered within a narrow region beyond the Kuiper Belt, and the timing of their appearances followed a loose but persistent rhythm. 3 at last suddenly felt less singular and more like part of a pattern. Across roughly 40 years of observational records, similar objects seem to arrive every 8 to 12 years, linger briefly, and then fade back into obscurity. Individually, none of these events were compelling enough to challenge existing models, but collectively they suggested repetition. Repetition in astronomy often points to orbital mechanics, yet the spacing and orientation of these appearances resisted simple gravitational explanation. 3 at last fit into this sequence with unsettling precision. The hypothesis that emerged described these objects as observers rather than travelers. In this model, 3 at last is not a lone interstellar wanderer, but one node within a distributed system designed to revisit developing star systems at regular intervals. Such a system would not require constant presence because periodic observation is sufficient to track long-term trends. 3I at last, by slowing and lingering, appears to fulfill exactly that role. Emotionally, the notion of cyclical surveillance introduces a quieter unease than sudden discovery. Being watched once can be framed as coincidence, but being watched repeatedly suggests intention over time. 3I at last does not overwhelm the senses, yet it implies duration, patience, and memory. Those qualities feel incompatible with random cosmic debris. From a strategic perspective, a cyclical network minimizes interference while maximizing information. An observing system that checks in every few generations could track technological growth, environmental change, and social stability without altering outcomes directly. 3I at last may therefore represent a conservative approach, one that favors long arcs over short interventions. The object's restraint becomes part of its function. Importantly, this hypothesis does not require a centralized intelligence issuing commands. A distributed network could operate autonomously, guided by simple rules established long ago. 3I at last may follow protocols rather than instructions, responding to thresholds rather than messages. Longevity replaces urgency as the defining feature. As this idea settles, the narrative shifts again. If observation is cyclical, then presence is conditional rather than constant. 3I at last arrives not because something has gone wrong, but because something has reached a point worth noting. In that realization, attention moves forward toward response, because once observation becomes systematic, interaction becomes a question of timing rather than possibility. The inverse mathematical response attributed to 3I at last entered the record after a controlled transmission was sent toward the object using deliberately simple numerical patterns. Researchers chose sequences that carried no semantic content beyond structure because mathematics provides a neutral baseline that minimizes cultural interpretation. 3. I at last did not respond immediately, and for a time the transmission appeared to vanish into background noise. This delay reinforced the assumption that no interaction had occurred. Hours later, detectors registered a brief emission aligned spatially with 3I at last, and the structure of that emission mirrored the original sequence in inverted form. The inversion was precise, preserving relational ratios while reversing progression, a transformation that requires comprehension rather than coincidence. Natural processes can echo energy, but they do not perform logical inversion without an organizing mechanism. 3. I at last, therefore, introduced a new category of anomaly, one rooted not in motion or structure, but in response. From an analytical standpoint, the response did not amplify the original message, nor did it elaborate on it. Instead, 3I at last reflected the transmission back in altered form, as though acknowledging receipt without inviting continuation. This restraint matters because it suggests control over engagement rather than eagerness for exchange. 3. I at last neither escalated nor withdrew, but maintained equilibrium. Emotionally, the response carries a weight that is difficult to articulate. There is something disquieting about being answered without being addressed. 3I at last did not speak, but it demonstrated awareness, and awareness alone alters the relationship between observer and observed. The silence that followed felt different from the silence that came before. The inversion itself functions as a boundary marker. By responding mathematically but withholding additional information, 3I at last appears to establish symmetry without intimacy. This symmetry suggests parity of logic rather than equality of position. 3. I at last confirms comprehension while preserving distance. In communication theory, such behavior is consistent with acknowledgement protocols rather than dialogue. A system that confirms receipt without transmitting intent prioritizes stability over exchange. 3I at last may therefore be operating under constraints that favor observation while limiting influence. The response becomes an endpoint rather than an opening. As this realization settles, the narrative shifts once more. 3. I at last no longer occupies the category of silent object, yet it also refuses classification as an active communicator. The inverse response exists between those states, confirming capability without revealing purpose. That ambiguity sustains tension without resolution. This section closes with a subtle transition. Once response is established, escalation becomes a choice rather than a necessity. 3. I at last appears content to remain at the threshold of interaction, neither retreating nor advancing. In that balanced posture, the story moves forward, carrying the awareness that 3. I at last has listened, understood, and chosen to remain precisely where it is. The appearance of a second object designated 4I Pegasus altered the interpretive frame surrounding 3I at last without introducing new spectacle. Unlike the discovery of 3I at last, which arrived as a singular anomaly, 4I Pegasus emerged quietly from a different vector entering the solar system on a trajectory that appeared deliberately offset.